"That baby is not your child, Uncle." The entire engagement party of the Mafia boss fell into dead silence when the 3-year-old girl spoke. No one believed that a child could change the fate of an entire crime family. Until Lorenzo DeLuca decided to go find the truth. 6 months before the child would speak, Lorenzo DeLuca walked slowly through the white rose garden of his 3-story gray stone mansion on the Upper East Side, a cup of espresso gone cold in his hand. The garden was quiet at that hour. It was almost always quiet. He was 38 years old, the youngest boss the East Coast had produced in half a century. The Brooklyn docks answered to him. 3 Manhattan hotels bore no name on their glass doors but paid him quietly every quarter. A federal maritime shipping network moved 100 containers a week through waters no one else could touch. Men twice his age lowered their voices when he entered a room. None of it had come easily. None of it had come without a price. The price had been paid 19 years earlier, on a Tuesday in October, in a Little Italy restaurant with red checkered tablecloths and a jukebox that had been playing an old Sinatra song. Lorenzo had been 19. His father, Antonio DeLuca, had been 47, a man who ran the family with an old country patience and a soft voice that never needed to rise. They had been eating veal marsala. Lorenzo remembered that detail with a clarity that no amount of time had softened. The first bullet came through the front window. It found Antonio's chest before Antonio had time to set down his fork. The second bullet was meant for Lorenzo. It never reached him. A boy named Marco Salvi, 17, thin, the son of a soldier loyal to Antonio for 2 decades, had thrown himself between Lorenzo and the door. The bullet passed through Marco's shoulder and shattered a wine glass on the table behind him. Marco fell across Lorenzo, still breathing, still gripping his sleeve, whispering something Lorenzo could not understand through the ringing in his ears. Antonio died on the floor between 2 chairs. Marco lived. That was how it began. That was how a boy of 19 inherited an empire he had not asked for, and how a boy of 17 became the only person Lorenzo would ever fully trust. 15 years passed. Marco rose beside him first as bodyguard, then as capo, then as underboss, then as something that had no name in the language of the streets. Brother. Not by blood, by debt, by the geometry of that one night. Lorenzo built his empire in Marco's shadow, and Marco built his life in Lorenzo's. They ate at the same table. They planned at the same desk. They buried the same enemies. In 15 years, Lorenzo had never once checked whether Marco was standing behind him. Behind Marco was the only place in the world he did not check. Every other door in his life, he checked twice before sleeping. He kept his back to walls. He let no one, no capo, no woman, no servant walk behind him without turning his head. On his left hand, just below the knuckle of his ring finger, there was a small pale scar from a piece of flying glass that October night. He touched it sometimes without knowing he was doing it. A boy who loses his father learns to doubt every hand extended to him except the hand that once took a bullet in his place. In the west wing of that same mansion, on the same morning Lorenzo walked among his white roses. A woman moved through the marble corridors so quietly that even the old floorboards had learned not to speak beneath her feet. Her name was Sophia Bennett. She was 30 years old. She had been the head housekeeper of the DeLuca residence for exactly 3 years and 2 months, and in all that time, she had never once looked the boss in the eye. She had learned that on the first day, a widow in a house of powerful men learned quickly. 3 years earlier, on a wet March evening, her husband had not come home from what he had described only as a small job in Red Hook. Michael Bennett had been a low-ranking soldier for the DeLuca family, a man who wore his loyalty like a wedding ring he never took off, who had never once told his wife what he actually did on the nights he left the apartment in Queens with a jacket buttoned all the way to his throat. He had died in a warehouse near the water in a quiet exchange of fire between 2 crews over a shipment of no particular importance. 6 men had walked into that warehouse. 5 had walked out. The knock on Sophia's apartment door had come at 11:27 at night. She remembered the exact time because she had been feeding Emma, who was 6 months old, in the yellow rocking chair by the window. She had heard the elevator open, then footsteps in the hallway that stopped outside her door and did not knock for what she later learned had been 30 seconds. When she opened it, Lorenzo DeLuca had been standing there alone. No driver, no capo, just a young man of 35 holding his hat in both hands. And his hands had been trembling. She had never seen a boss tremble before. She had never seen a boss come himself to deliver that particular kind of news. He had said only what needed to be said, in the fewest words the language allowed, and then he had told her that she and her daughter would never lack a roof or a meal, for as long as the DeLuca name meant anything on the East Coast. 2 weeks later, a job offer had arrived through a lawyer's office. Head housekeeper, a private room in the West Wing, full board, A salary that was almost embarrassing. She had understood what it was. A quiet compensation for a loss that could never be compensated. She had taken it anyway. She had a baby who had already lost her father. She could not afford pride. 3 years passed. She learned every corridor of that mansion the way another woman might learn a prayer, by walking it until it lived inside her feet. She did not look at the boss. She did not speak above the volume of the wind outside the windows. She did not ask questions. Not about the men who came and went. Not about the meetings in the study that lasted past midnight. Not about the guns she sometimes had to move aside when dusting a shelf. Emma grew up in those marble corridors. By 2 years old, she knew the name of every marble statue in the Great Hall, and by 3, she could name every rose bush in the garden and tell you which one bloomed first each spring. She carried a small stuffed rabbit everywhere she went, a gray, uneven, hand-stitched creature named Bunny that Sophia had sewn from Michael's old wool coat the winter after he died. The rabbit had 2 mismatched button eyes and 1 ear that flopped forward because Sophia had been crying too hard the night she stitched it to make the seams even. Lorenzo rarely looked at Sophia directly, but every year, on the anniversary of Michael's death, a plain white envelope appeared on her nightstand. It was never handed to her. It was simply there when she woke. Inside were enough banknotes to cover a year of Emma's daycare, and a single folded note that said only, "He was a good man. L." She never thanked him for the envelopes. He never asked her to. Some women wear widowhood like a black dress. Sophia wore hers like skin. While Sophia moved through the mansion like a shadow that had made peace with its own silence, another woman was preparing, in a mirror across the river, to enter that same house and never leave the same way she came. Her name was Vivian Romano. She was 26 years old. She was the only daughter of Don Vittorio Romano, the head of the Romano crime family across the water in New Jersey, the family that had spilled DeLuca blood, and spilled DeLuca blood in return, for 30 consecutive years. 2 grandfathers, 1 uncle, 6 capos. The count was long enough that the older men on both sides had stopped keeping it. 2 years before the night the child would speak, Marco Salvi had walked into Lorenzo's study on a Sunday afternoon and set a bottle of Barolo on the desk between them. He had spoken slowly, the way a man speaks when he has been rehearsing. 30 years is long enough, brother. There is a way to end it that costs no one else his life. A dinner. Just a dinner. Don Romano has a daughter. She is unmarried. If you meet her, and if nothing happens, then nothing happens. But if something happens, then 30 years of war end with 2 people sitting at a table instead of 6 men bleeding in a warehouse. Lorenzo had listened. He had trusted Marco the way a man trusts his own hand. He had agreed. Vivian had walked into that first dinner wearing a red silk dress cut precisely at the collarbone, her dark hair swept over one shoulder. She had known exactly how long to hold Lorenzo's gaze before turning her eyes to her wineglass. She had known exactly which of his dark stories to smile at, and which to answer with a soft, level question that told him she was not afraid of any of them. She had never once asked what he did. She had only asked who he was underneath what he did. Lorenzo fell fast. He fell the way a man falls who has spent 19 years building walls and has finally met someone who seemed to be already inside them. 2 years of dating followed. The underworld pressed the quiet channels that carried news between the 5 families, called it the fated romance of the East Coast, a DeLuca and a Romano, wine at the same table where their fathers had once traded bullets. No one asked why Marco Salvi took such personal care in the arrangement of every date. Marco chose the restaurants. Marco checked the security. Marco personally reviewed the routes. Marco, on the evenings when Lorenzo was pulled away by a call from the docks or a meeting in the study, was the one who quietly drove Vivian home across the George Washington Bridge, her hand resting on the console between their seats, her laughter carrying through the open window into the summer night. Lorenzo saw none of it. He was in love, and love has its own kind of blindness, the kind that trusts every hand that has ever helped build the thing it is holding. A man in love does not notice how many bridges his brother has been quietly building behind him. It was a Saturday afternoon in the second week of September, and the light in the rose garden had turned that particular shade of gold that only exists for 1 hour at the end of summer. Vivian had asked him to walk with her. She had said it in a soft voice, the way she said most things now. Lorenzo followed her out through the tall French doors of the east drawing room, past the marble fountain that no longer ran because his mother had disliked the sound of running water, and out onto the gravel path that curved between the white rose bushes. The air smelled of cut grass and something older, the last of the late-blooming Sicilian whites his grandfather had planted the year the family first bought the house. Vivian stopped him at the far end of the garden, where the path opened into a small circle of stones. She was wearing a soft ivory dress that fell just below her knees. She had taken his hand without saying anything, and then she had placed it flat against the low curve of her stomach, held it there with both of her own, and looked up at him. "You're going to be a father." Lorenzo did not answer for what felt like a long time. Something in his chest did a thing it had not done in 19 years. It opened, just slightly, just enough to let in a light he had forgotten he was allowed to feel. Then the man who had made 3 empires bow their heads did something none of his capos would have believed if they had seen it. He sank slowly to his knees on the gravel path in front of her, took the thin silk of her dress carefully in his fingers, and pressed his lips to the low curve of her belly through the fabric. He stayed there a long time. She did not move. That night, alone in his study, he made a single phone call. Marco arrived within 30 minutes. Still wearing the loose shirt he had put on for a quiet Saturday evening at home, Lorenzo told him. Marco did not laugh. Marco did not smile too quickly. Marco crossed the study in 3 long strides, pulled him into a hard embrace, and held him the way brothers hold each other at funerals and at births. "The DeLuca bloodline lives on," Marco said quietly into his shoulder. "Your father is smiling tonight." Then Marco stepped back, and it was Marco who spoke first about what came next. "You have to do this publicly, brother. An announcement like this cannot be whispered. Every boss, every capo, every consigliere on the East Coast has to be in the room. Announce the heir the same night as the engagement. It will strengthen your position for the next 20 years. No one will move against a house with a bloodline." Marco proposed the location, the great hall of the mansion itself, under the crystal chandeliers where Antonio DeLuca had once hosted the truces of the previous generation. Marco proposed the timing 3 weeks from that night, giving just enough time for the invitations to travel and no time at all for rival houses to plan around it. Marco proposed the guest list. 300 names, every family, every faction. The most important name on that list, Marco said gently, would be Don Vittorio Romano himself, invited as guest of honor, to publicly and formally end 30 years of war between the 2 houses on the same night his daughter accepted the DeLuca ring. Lorenzo agreed to all of it. He agreed the way a son agrees to the advice of a father he has already lost once and cannot afford to lose again. A man in love hears his brother's advice like scripture. He does not notice when the scripture has been rewritten. 2 weeks before the great hall would fill with 300 guests, Sophia was on the 2nd floor of the West Wing, running a soft cloth along the tall mahogany dresser in what had recently become Vivian's private suite. She worked the way she always worked, slowly, quietly, with the kind of care that leaves no fingerprint on wood or memory in a room. Emma sat cross-legged on the pale blue carpet a few meters behind her, humming to herself, arranging her colored pencils into a careful row by shade. Bunny lay across her lap with his one flopping ear folded down. She was 3 years old, small for her age, and she had inherited from her mother the habit of doing quiet things quietly. The door of the small study adjoining Vivian's suite was open, not fully, just 5 centimeters. Enough for sound to travel through the gap without either voice on the other side, realizing that the gap existed at all. Sophia heard them before she recognized them. Vivian's voice, first low, careful, the way she never spoke. She only stood there, the cloth pressed flat against the wood, and listened without meaning to. She caught fragments, broken pieces of sentences that did not fit any world she thought she was living in. "He still believes it's his." Vivian's voice, softer than Sophia had ever heard it. "Our child, Marco. Not his. Ours." A pause. A rustling of fabric. Marco's voice, lower, closer to the door. "After the wedding, the DeLuca name is all we need. The council cannot touch a child that carries that name." Another pause. Vivian again, almost a whisper. "And Lorenzo? What about him? After. We'll figure out how to deal with him then. One thing at a time. First the ring, first the name." Sophia felt her hand go cold against the dresser. She did not remember lifting the cloth. She did not remember turning around. She only remembered crossing the pale blue carpet in 3 quick steps, scooping Emma up into her arms along with the row of colored pencils, and Bunny still clutched against the child's chest, and walking out of that suite as softly as she had walked in. She did not stop moving until she was out of the mansion, through the service gate, and 3 blocks down the sidewalk on her way to the bus stop. Emma had not made a sound the entire way, but Emma's small ears had been more awake than her mother's. On the crosstown bus that evening, riding home through the amber light of a September rush hour toward the 2-room apartment in Queens they still kept because Sophia had not been able to give it up, Emma looked up from Sophia's lap with her large brown eyes. "Mommy, why is Aunt Vivian's baby Uncle Marco's baby?" Sophia froze, every muscle in her back locked in place. The old woman across the aisle turned her head slightly. Sophia pulled Emma tighter against her chest, close enough to feel the child's heartbeat against her collarbone, and lowered her mouth to Emma's ear. "You misheard, sweetheart. Please don't repeat that. Not to anyone. Not to Uncle Lorenzo. Not to any of the men in the big house. Not to anyone. Not ever." Emma looked up at her with the wide, uncomprehending eyes of a child who has just been given a rule she cannot understand and therefore cannot fully keep. "Okay, Mommy." Sophia did not sleep that night. She lay on her side in the dark of the small bedroom with Emma curled asleep against her chest, and she stared at the ceiling and understood two things at once. She had just heard something that could burn the DeLuca house to the ground, and if Marco or Vivian ever learned that she had heard it, she and Emma would not live to see the following Sunday. But Emma was 3 years old. 3-year-olds do not understand the concept of a secret. They understand only the shape of what they have heard, and the small mouth that has heard it. Children do not know how to invent what they do not understand. That, in the end, is why the truth almost always finds their mouths first. The night before the Great Hall would open its doors to 300 guests, Emma's fever came without warning. Sophia had put her daughter to bed at 7 in the evening as usual. By 10, the child's cheeks were flushed, her forehead damp, and her small hand hot against her mother's palm. The thermometer, when Sophia finally found it in the drawer of the kitchen, read 103.1. She held it under the yellow bulb above the sink and read it again. The number did not change. The daycare center on Northern Boulevard did not accept sick children. That was the first phone call, made at 7 the next morning, standing in her small kitchen in Queens, with Emma wrapped in a blanket on the couch behind her. The woman on the other end was apologetic but firm. Fever policy, no exceptions. Sophia hung up and looked at her sleeping daughter and understood that she had a choice to make, and that neither side of the choice was really a choice. The engagement party required every hand in the mansion, every server, every cleaner, every kitchen aide, 300 guests, 12 courses, a Sicilian tenor flown in from Palermo, an ice sculpture the size of a man that had to be moved into place at 4 in the afternoon. The head of household staff had been very clear. Anyone who did not appear tomorrow would not appear at all after that. She drove Emma into Manhattan that morning wrapped in the same blanket, because there was nowhere else she could think to bring her. In the mansion's great kitchen, already half transformed for the evening, the marble counters lined with silver trays, and the air thick with the smell of rosemary and clarified butter. Sophia stood by the service phone with the receiver in her trembling hand, and no one to call. She did not hear him come in. Lorenzo passed through the kitchen on his way from the wine cellar to the study, a folded list in one hand, and he stopped when he saw her. He did not ask what was wrong. He looked at the child on the folded coat in the corner chair, at the small, flushed face pressed against a gray stuffed rabbit, and he understood. Bring her tomorrow. No, bring her today. He corrected himself. She stays. The family sitting room upstairs, the small one off the east corridor. It is quiet there. No one will go in during the party. She will be safe. Sophia opened her mouth. He was already turning away. It's decided, Miss Bennet. Go and see to your daughter. He did not ask Vivian. He did not think to. He did not consider that Marco might notice a housekeeper's sick child asleep in a sitting room above the great hall. To him it was only a fevered little girl and a desperate mother, and he had learned long ago that the smallest kindnesses were the ones a man could still afford without asking permission from anyone. That same evening, at 11:42, in the private wing of the east side of the mansion, a security camera mounted above the corridor recorded 10 seconds of footage that no one would think to watch until much later. Marco Salvi walked slowly down the corridor, paused outside Vivian's suite, and knocked once. She opened the door. He stepped inside just far enough for the camera to still see him. He placed his right hand on the low curve of her stomach, held it there for 3 full seconds, then leaned down and pressed his lips lightly to her forehead. He said something the microphone did not catch. She nodded. He turned, stepped back into the corridor, and walked away. 10 seconds. Recorded, time-stamped, filed. There are 10 seconds in every man's life that will one day cost him everything. That night, Marco spent his. By 8 in the evening, the great hall of the DeLuca mansion had become a country of its own. 300 guests. A string quartet arranged in a half-circle on the raised platform beneath the largest of the crystal chandeliers. Champagne carried on silver trays that never seemed to empty. Every capo, every consigliere, every boss from Boston to Baltimore, standing in small clusters beneath the tall windows, speaking in the careful, low voices of men who had grown up knowing which words could not be said in a room like this one. Vivian stood in the center of it all. Her gown was a floor-length column of white silk cut close to the shoulder, and it moved when she moved the way water moves when a stone is dropped into still water. Her dark hair had been pinned in a low knot at the base of her neck. There was a small blush of color on her cheeks that had not come from any powder. Lorenzo stood beside her in a tuxedo the color of gray stone. His hand rested at the small of her back, with the kind of steady certainty a man reserves for the thing in his life he has decided not to lose. Marco Salvi stood at Lorenzo's right shoulder. Brother, best man, the one who would read the first toast of the night. At the head table sat Don Vittorio Romano, 60 years old, silver at his temples, his 4 bodyguards arranged behind him in a quiet line. He had not stood when Lorenzo entered the hall. He had only lifted his glass a small measured inch in Lorenzo's direction, and Lorenzo had answered the gesture with a nod of his own. 30 years of blood, folded neatly into a single motion of glassware. 2 floors above the great hall, in the small service pantry beside the family kitchen, Sophia was folding linen napkins into the shape of a swan, the way the catering supervisor had shown her that afternoon. Emma slept on the long padded bench beneath the window, curled beneath a folded wool blanket, Bunny tucked under her chin. Her fever had come down. Her small breath was even. Sophia checked her every few minutes without meaning to. Downstairs, Vivian raised her glass. Her voice carried into the hall the way she had rehearsed it, clear, warm, with a small, deliberate tremor at the edge like a violin string held one moment too long. To all of you who have come tonight to bless this union, 30 years of shadow between our families ends in this room, and it ends because tonight I am also carrying the heir of the DeLuca empire. The hall did not just applaud. The hall broke, champagne raised, camera flashes. An old capo from Providence set his glass down to bring his palms together. Someone near the back began to cheer in Italian. The string quartet lifted their bows and started the first bars of a soft, celebratory piece. 2 floors above, Emma stirred at the sound. She sat up, rubbing her eyes. Bunny slid from her lap onto the bench. She looked around the small pantry, saw the doorway open, and slipped down onto her small bare feet. Sophia turned from the counter and saw her daughter halfway across the pantry, already at the edge of the corridor that led to the mezzanine landing above the great hall. She knelt fast, arms open. Emma, sweetheart, come here. We have to go back. But Emma had already reached the balustrade of the mezzanine. Below her, through the carved wooden railing, she could see the woman in the long white dress standing under the biggest of the crystal chandeliers. "Mommy," she whispered, wide-eyed. "Pretty dress." Sophia's hand closed around her daughter's small wrist. She looked down at the hall. She looked at the private staircase that curved down toward the side of the great room. Just for 1 minute, she told herself. Just to see the pretty dress, then straight back up. She carried Emma down the side stairs and stopped in the shadow of the tall marble column at the northeast corner of the hall. From there, half hidden by the column and the trailing white roses that had been wrapped around it for the evening, Emma could see everything. Vivian was still speaking. Marco was smiling beside Lorenzo. The applause was just beginning to fade into the softer sound of 300 people lifting glasses in the same slow motion. In that small pocket of silence between the applause and the first sip of champagne, a clear voice rang out from beneath the marble column at the corner of the hall. "That baby is not your child, Uncle." 300 faces turned. Emma was not looking at Vivian. She was looking straight at Marco Salvi. Vivian's face went the color of the white silk she was standing in. Marco stepped back half a step, only half out of the direct beam of the chandelier above him. But Lorenzo, 15 meters away, saw it. His eyes did not move from Marco's face for 3 full seconds. Then Lorenzo smiled. It was the smile of a boss, the smile that had ended arguments in 3 cities, and he lifted his own glass and said in the warm, easy voice of a man who is not afraid of anything in his own house, "Children say the most extraordinary things at parties." The hall laughed. Champagne was refilled. The string quartet lifted its bows and began the next piece. Sophia was already carrying Emma back up the side staircase with her hand pressed lightly over her daughter's mouth, but the door had been opened, and nothing in that house would ever close it again. 300 people held their breath at the same time. Only 2 people in that room forgot to. By 1 in the morning, the last of the guests had passed through the tall front doors of the mansion and into their waiting cars. Lorenzo stood at the top of the marble steps in his gray tuxedo and shook the hand of every man who left. He kissed the cheek of every consigliere's wife. He accepted every congratulation with the same warm, slow nod, the same practiced smile. Not one of them saw anything on his face they had not been meant to see. When the last car pulled away down the long gravel drive, he walked back into the great hall alone. The staff had already begun the quiet work of dismantling the evening folding chairs against the far wall, gathering empty glasses onto silver trays, sweeping small white rose petals from the floor beneath the chandeliers. He did not look at any of them. Vivian was waiting for him at the foot of the main staircase. Her hair had come slightly loose from its knot. She looked tired in the way a woman looks tired when she has been performing for 6 straight hours. He crossed to her, took her face in both hands, and kissed her softly on the forehead. His lips did not tremble. His hands did not tremble. "Go to bed," he said. "I have a few things to finish in the study. Don't wait up. Are you all right?" "I've never been better." She searched his face for a small moment. He gave her nothing to find. She nodded, climbed the stairs, and disappeared into the east corridor. He walked to his study, closed the tall oak door behind him, and turned the brass key in the lock. Then he crossed to the sideboard, took down the bottle of Barolo from the top shelf, the one with the small carved letters D, L, on the glass, and poured a single glass. He carried it to the leather chair behind the desk, sat down, and did not move. He sat there for 30 minutes without drinking. Then, slowly, the pieces began to arrive. Marco had stood too close to Vivian at last Sunday's dinner. Lorenzo had not noticed at the time. Now, in the quiet of the study, he saw again the way Marco's hand had brushed the small of her back as he pulled out her chair, the way his fingers had lingered a half-second longer than a brother's fingers should linger. Vivian had looked away from him 3 weeks earlier when he had asked her the exact date the child was due. She had said late April, and then quickly changed the subject to the color of the nursery walls. Marco had personally recommended the obstetrician a doctor, Aldo Petrucci, a name Lorenzo had never heard, whose office was somewhere in Bergen County across the river. Vivian had gone to every prenatal appointment alone. She had refused, gently, every time Lorenzo had offered to come with her. "You have too much on your shoulders already, amore. Let me carry this part." Marco had sold his apartment in Tribeca 6 months earlier. He had told Lorenzo he was renting temporarily while he looked for something larger. In 6 months, Lorenzo had never been given the new address. He had not thought to ask. Small pieces, each one, on its own, meaningless. Together, they began to line up in his mind the way pieces of a broken mirror line up on a table when a patient hand starts to move them. He did not want to see the shape they were making. But once a boss begins to see a shape, he can never make himself unsee it. He looked at the untouched glass of Barolo. He looked at the small pale scar on his left hand. Then he picked up the phone. He made only 2 calls before dawn. Doubt is a mirror. Once cracked, it will never show the same face again. The first call went out at 6:20 in the morning, before the mansion staff had finished folding the last of the linen from the night before. Dr. Salvatore Costa arrived at the service entrance of the mansion at 7:45, carrying a small black leather bag, and wearing the same wool overcoat he had worn to house calls for the DeLuca family, since Antonio DeLuca had first hired him 32 years earlier. He was 55 now, silver at the temples, quiet in the way old family physicians learn to be quiet. He was the only man alive, besides Marco, that Lorenzo still trusted with the shape of his own breath. Lorenzo received him in the study with the door locked and the curtains drawn. "I need a prenatal paternity test," he said. "Non-invasive, completely off the books. No lab number connected to this name, no charge on any account. Nothing that can be traced back to this house." Dr. Costa set his bag down on the desk. He looked at Lorenzo for a long moment. He did not ask why. "I will need 2 samples. A cheek swab is easiest for the father. For the mother, anything with fresh saliva or hair root, a coffee cup, a used toothbrush, a comb." Lorenzo walked to the small dressing table in the alcove behind his desk. He took down a tortoiseshell comb he had used that same morning and laid it in a clean linen napkin. Then he crossed to the small kitchenette off the study, where a maid had brought Vivian her usual espresso at 6:30, and where the small porcelain cup still sat on the tray, the faint mark of her lipstick on the rim. He wrapped the cup in a second linen napkin himself. He did not let anyone else touch it. He handed both to Dr. Costa in a small paper bag. "How long?" 3 days. "I will run it twice. Run it 3 times." Dr. Costa nodded once. He picked up his black bag, tucked the paper bag inside it, and walked out of the study the way he had walked in. Lorenzo locked the door behind him. The second call went out at 8 in the morning. Enzo Marchetti arrived at the same service entrance 90 minutes later. He was 42, thin, gray in a way that did not match his age, and he had not sat down in Lorenzo's study in almost 10 years. 10 years earlier, Enzo's 4-year-old son had been taken from a schoolyard in Bay Ridge by 3 men in a black van. Lorenzo had gotten the boy back within 48 hours. Enzo had never once been asked to repay that debt. He had waited a decade for the phone to ring, and now it had rung. Lorenzo did not offer him coffee. "I need you to follow 2 people for 3 days, Marco Salvi and Vivian Romano. Every hour they are apart from me. Every place they go, Every person they meet. No capo of mine can know. No man in this house can know. Not even the boy at my front gate. Enzo did not blink. If you find nothing, Lorenzo said, we never spoke. And if I find something, bring me everything. Enzo looked at him for a long time. He had known Lorenzo since Lorenzo was 22 years old. He had seen him bury his father. He had seen him bury 3 capos. He had never seen the particular kind of stillness that was in Lorenzo's face that morning. He nodded once, stood, and walked out. When a man begins to hunt his own brother, he learns to walk backward through his own house. 3 days passed. Lorenzo moved through them the way a man moves through the last week of a house he already knows he is going to burn down. He kissed Vivian's forehead in the mornings. He ate breakfast across from her. He asked about the nursery walls. He did not raise his voice. He did not look at Marco any differently than he had for 15 years. He was a boss. He had learned young how to hold 2 faces at once. On the 3rd afternoon, at 4 p.m. on the dot, Dr. Costa arrived at the service entrance in the same wool overcoat. He carried a plain cream-colored envelope. He handed it to Lorenzo in the study without a word. Then he turned and left, because he was old enough and wise enough to know when a room did not want a witness. Lorenzo locked the door. He crossed to the desk. He sat down. He turned the envelope over in his hand twice before he opened it. The report was 1 page. The number he was looking for was in the 3rd line from the top. Probability of paternity, 0%. The paper trembled in his hand. He set it flat on the desk and pressed his palm against it as if pressure could change the reading. He read it again. 3 times. 4. He turned the page over. The back was blank. 0%. Not low, not uncertain, not within a margin. 0. He did not cry. He did not break anything. His shoulders did not move. Only a small muscle at the corner of his jaw moved, once, and then went still again. Half an hour later, at 4:35, Enzo Marchetti arrived carrying a brown leather briefcase. He did not sit. He set the briefcase on the desk beside the paternity report, opened the 2 brass clasps, and began to place its contents on the wood, 1 item at a time. First, photographs, 4 of them, black and white, taken from 20 meters away with a long lens. Marco and Vivian leaving the Plaza Hotel together on a Wednesday afternoon 3 months earlier. Marco's hand on the small of her back the way it had brushed at the Sunday dinner. Her head tilted toward his shoulder. In one image, she was laughing. Second, receipts, a stack an inch thick, held together with a plain rubber band. Jewelry Marco had purchased over the past 2 years, from 3 different jewelers in 3 different cities, always paid in cash. Near the top, a diamond bracelet from a shop on 5th Avenue, purchase price, $200,000. Lorenzo recognized it. Vivian had worn it to a dinner in June, and had told him, when he had admired it, that it had been her mother's, left to her when she turned 25. Third, hotel bills. Boston, in November of the previous year, when Vivian had told Lorenzo she was visiting an old college friend. Miami, in February, the same story. Vienna, in April, a European trip she had described to Lorenzo as a solo retreat before the wedding. Each bill was for a single room. Each was booked in Marco's name. Each showed 2 occupants. Fourth, and last, a small digital audio recorder. Enzo pressed play. A woman's voice came through the small speaker, tinny but unmistakable. Vivian, after the wedding, once the child bears the DeLuca name, we won't need him anymore. My father will handle the rest. There was a pause on the recording, then Marco's voice, low, close to the microphone. You are sure? Once your father moves, there is no going back. I have been sure since the day you first put your hand on me. Everything else has just been theater. Enzo pressed stop. Lorenzo did not move for a long time. Then he rose slowly, crossed to the sideboard, and lifted down the bottle of Barolo, the one with the carved letters. He poured a single glass, carried it back to the desk, and took 1 slow sip. The sun was beginning to set through the tall windows behind him. The light on the wall behind Enzo had turned the color of old copper. Enzo did not move from the corner of the room. He had learned, in 20 years of this work, how to stand still until a man was ready to speak. Finally, Lorenzo lifted his eyes. How long? Enzo answered without hesitation. Before you and Vivian ever met, boss. Marco brought her to you already loving him. The first dinner was not the beginning of anything. It was the middle. Lorenzo closed his eyes. He kept them closed for 10 full seconds. When he opened them again, his face had not changed, but his voice, when it came, was the calmest thing that had ever left his mouth. Call the council. Tomorrow at noon. Every capo. Every consigliere I trust. Marco is to be present. Tell him it is a strategy meeting for the wedding. And send an invitation, tonight, by hand, to Don Vittorio Romano. Ask him to attend as guest of honor. Tell him we have an announcement to make about the future of our two families. Enzo did not ask if he was certain. He only nodded, closed the briefcase, and walked out of the study. Lorenzo sat alone with the glass of Barolo and the paternity report and the small audio recorder until the last of the light had gone out of the windows and the room was completely dark. Betrayal is not a knife. It is a slow tide that takes everything you thought was solid ground. At noon the following day, 9 of Lorenzo's most trusted capos filed into the long council room on the ground floor of the mansion. It was a room that had not been used since Antonio DeLuca's time, a chamber of dark walnut walls and a single long table of veined white marble, 16 chairs arranged around it, tall windows on the north wall that looked out onto the white rose garden. The air smelled faintly of beeswax and old wood. They took their places without speaking. Old Salvatore Bruno at the far end, Nico Ferrante and Enzo Marchetti to Lorenzo's left, the remaining 6 along the near side of the marble. Marco Salvi sat at Lorenzo's right, the same chair he had sat in for 11 years. He wore a charcoal jacket and a small, quiet smile, and he did not know yet what kind of meeting he had walked into. Vivian stood behind Marco's chair. She had been told, an hour before, that this was a final planning session for the wedding, the seating of the two families, the signature of the joint declaration of peace. She had put on a soft cream sweater and pearl earrings for the occasion. She rested one hand lightly on the back of Marco's chair. Across the length of the table from Lorenzo, Don Vittorio Romano lowered himself into the seat of honor. His 4 bodyguards arranged themselves in a quiet line behind him, 4 men in dark suits who had been admitted through the front gate of the DeLuca estate under a bilateral security agreement. Marco himself had drafted 2 weeks earlier. Their hands rested loose at their sides. None of them sat. Lorenzo waited until the room was completely still. Then he spoke. Before we plan the wedding, we should first plan the truth. He set the cream-colored envelope on the marble in front of him. He slid it across the table with 2 fingers until it stopped in front of Marco. Marco did not open it. He looked at Lorenzo, and in the 3 seconds that followed, every mask he had worn for 15 years came off his face at once. He did not try to put them back on. Something in him understood immediately that there was no version of the next hour in which the pretending still worked. Lorenzo did not need him to open it. He laid the next things down himself. The 4 photographs from the Plaza Hotel, placed side by side on the marble in the order Enzo had taken them. The stack of jewelry receipts, still bound with the plain rubber band, set beside the photographs. The 3 hotel bills, Boston, Miami, Vienna, laid in a slow, neat row. And finally, the small black audio recorder. Lorenzo pressed the play button himself. Vivian's voice came into the council room clean and unmistakable, carried by the small speaker into the far corners of the walnut walls. After the wedding, once the child bears the DeLuca name, we won't need him anymore. My father will handle the rest. The 9 capos did not move. Old Salvatore Bruno, at the far end of the table, set his glass down without looking at it. Nico Ferrante's hand went slowly to his own knee. No one spoke. Marco did not deny it. He did not apologize. He did not open his mouth at all. He only turned his head slowly to look up at Vivian. Vivian's face had gone very pale, but she did not look afraid. She looked at Marco for a long moment, and then she gave him a small, almost invisible nod. She took 1 step out from behind his chair. She raised her left hand, slid the emerald-cut diamond ring off her finger with 2 careful fingers of her right hand, and let it fall. The ring that had belonged to Lorenzo's grandmother, that had waited in a velvet box in the family vault for 41 years, struck the marble with a small, clean sound. It rolled a short arc across the polished stone, turning once, twice, and came to rest, touching the base of Lorenzo's Barolo glass with the softest click. Vivian's voice, when it came, was very quiet, but the whole council room heard it. I loved Marco from before I met you. I'm sorry, Lorenzo, but I'm not sorry enough to lie any longer. Some rings are heavier when they leave the finger than when they arrived on it. Lorenzo rose slowly from his chair. He did not look at Vivian. He did not look at Marco. He looked only at the ring resting against the base of his glass. Then he lifted his eyes to the 9 capos who had followed his father before they had followed him, and he opened his mouth to speak the old words. Under the law of the family, the words that named a betrayal of blood, the words that carried a sentence no boss delivered without weighing it against his own soul first. He never said them. Across the length of the marble table, Don Vittorio Romano also rose. He rose slowly, almost with ceremony. The way an older man rises when he intends the movement itself to say something. He did not speak. He only lifted his right hand, adjusted the cuff of his left sleeve, and touched the small silver cufflink twice with his thumb. That was the signal. The 4 men standing behind him, the 4 men who had walked through the front gate of the DeLuca estate 2 hours earlier under the bilateral security agreement, drafted in Marco Salvi's own hand, drew their weapons in a DeLuca Sissa's otter, single motion. They had rehearsed it. It looked rehearsed. The council room exploded. 2 floors above, in the family kitchen off the east corridor, Sophia had been folding a small stack of napkins by the window with Emma seated on the counter beside her, humming into Bunny's ear. The first sound that reached her was not clear. It was only a hard, flat crack that could have been anything. Then a second. Then a burst of them together, low and sharp, coming up through the floor. She did not think. She swept Emma off the counter, crossed the kitchen in 3 strides, pulled open the tall linen cupboard, and stepped inside with her daughter pressed against her chest. She pulled the door closed behind them. She sank to the floor of the cupboard, folded her body over Emma's small one, pressed one hand flat over the child's small ear, and pressed the other hand against her own mouth so hard her teeth cut into her lower lip. Emma did not cry. Emma had stopped making any sound at all. The only thing that moved was Bunny's soft gray ear against Sophia's chin. Below them, in the council room, Marco moved before the first bullet finished traveling. He caught Vivian by the wrist, spun her behind him, and pulled her toward the narrow side door at the west end of the chamber, a small paneled door disguised in the walnut wainscoting, opening onto a service passage that descended into the wine cellar. Only 3 people had ever known that passage existed: Antonio DeLuca, Lorenzo DeLuca, and, as a boy of 18, Marco Salvi, who had once been sent down that stair to retrieve a bottle for Antonio himself. 3 of the 9 capos died in the first exchange. Old Salvatore Bruno at the far end of the table. Nico Ferrante, still with his hand halfway to his knee. A 3rd man from Providence whose name Lorenzo would only be able to remember later. Lorenzo took the first bullet in his left shoulder. He did not fall. He had been reaching, before Don Romano had ever touched his cuff, for the small handgun that had been mounted on a spring bracket beneath the marble table for as long as the table had been in the room. A mounting his father had installed 30 years earlier, and had shown him at the age of 12. His right hand closed around the grip. He brought the weapon up under the edge of the table and fired twice. 2 of the 4 Romano gunmen fell. The other 2 turned toward him. Enzo Marchetti, from the left side of the table, took one of them down before the man could aim. The last one, wounded, retreated toward the main door. Don Vittorio Romano did not run through the main door. He did not need to. He crossed the council room in 6 long strides, followed the same paneled passage Marco had already opened, and disappeared into the wine cellar beneath the mansion. From there, through a tunnel Antonio DeLuca had cut into the bedrock in the year of the Cuban crisis to carry his family to the river in case of siege, he vanished into the streets of the Upper East Side. When the dust settled and the smell of gunpowder began to lift, the council room was full of blood and shattered crystal and the small dry rattle of a chandelier that had lost half of its pendants. Marco Salvi was gone. Vivian Romano was gone. Don Vittorio Romano was gone. No war had been declared. No war needed to be. Lorenzo stood alone in the center of the room with his right hand pressed to his bleeding left shoulder, and he looked down at the marble table. The emerald-cut ring was still resting exactly where it had come to rest, touching the base of his glass, catching a small piece of the light from the ruined chandelier above. He looked at it for a long time. A war does not begin with a bullet. It begins with a handshake that lasted 15 years too long. The war between the DeLuca and the Romano families broke open in the 4 weeks that followed the council room, and it broke open the way only a war fought from the inside can break open from the seams, from the places no outside enemy would ever have known to look. Marco Salvi knew everything. Every warehouse, every guard rotation, every quiet name on the DeLuca payroll, every side road the delivery trucks used along the coast. He knew which capo drank on Wednesdays and which one visited a mistress in Bensonhurst on the last Friday of every month. He had spent 15 years standing at Lorenzo's right shoulder taking that information into his memory, the way another man might have taken it into a notebook, and now he handed it, piece by piece, to Don Vittorio Romano across the river. 3 DeLuca warehouses burned in the first 10 days, 1 in Red Hook, 1 in Sunset Park, 1 in Bay Ridge, the biggest of them, taken out by a fire so complete that when the arson investigators arrived at dawn, there was nothing left standing except the metal skeleton of the loading dock. 2 shipping routes on the Brooklyn waterfront were cut, A container in Newark carrying goods worth several $100,000 simply disappeared between the port and the depot. Driver, truck, and cargo all gone. The truck later found empty in a marsh in New Jersey with the doors torn off, and the driver never found at all. 7 DeLuca soldiers were killed in the first week. 2 of them were men Lorenzo had known since they were boys. Lorenzo did not sleep. His left shoulder, dressed twice a day by Dr. Costa, was still wrapped under his shirt. He slept, when he slept at all, in 2-hour stretches in the leather chair behind his desk, his gun on the blotter in front of him. The mansion had been locked down. Only Enzo, Dr. Costa, and 3 of the 6 remaining loyal capos moved in and out through the service entrance. Sophia and Emma were still in the West Wing. Lorenzo had ordered it. He had told no one why. It was Enzo, on the 14th night, who brought him the intercepted call. A phone in a safe house in Fort Lee, tapped for 6 days by a friend of Enzo's inside the federal wiretap program. The voice on the recording was Marco's. Flat, cold, colder than Lorenzo had ever heard it. Though somehow he understood, listening, that it was the voice Marco had always had underneath the other one. The housekeeper's brat exposed everything. She and her mother, they cannot be allowed to speak again. Find them. Make it look like a burglary. Queens. 3rd floor walk-up. The address is in the file. Enzo turned off the recorder. It was 2 a.m. The rain had started against the tall study windows an hour earlier and had not stopped. Enzo said quietly, "There is a car already on the bridge. 15 minutes out, maybe less." Lorenzo did not answer. He rose from the desk. He crossed the study, took his coat off the hook by the door, put it on over the sling that held his left arm against his ribs, and picked up the keys to the black sedan he kept in the service garage. His right hand, his good hand, closed around them. "Do not follow me," he said. "Watch the house. Do not let anyone near her wing." He walked out through the service door alone. 10 minutes later, the black sedan crossed the Queensboro Bridge through the rain. 1 man behind the wheel, 1 hand on the top of the steering wheel, the other pressed flat against his ribs. The rain came sideways under the yellow lamps of the bridge. The wipers ran on the fastest setting. The clock on the dashboard read 2:17. Some men count their enemies. Lorenzo, that night, learned to count the seconds. He came up the stairwell of the 3rd floor walk-up, 3 steps at a time, and reached the door of apartment 3B, 30 seconds before the man on the fire escape reached the outside of the window in the small bedroom. The wood of the door was thin. He kicked it once beside the lock, with the flat of his right foot, and it gave. Sophia was standing in the short hallway that connected the front room to the small bedroom, and she was standing in the exact center of the doorway to that bedroom, with her back to the room behind her. In her right hand, held out in front of her body with both a fear and a resolve that Lorenzo had never seen on any of his soldiers, was an old kitchen knife with a red plastic handle. Her hair was loose, her feet were bare. She had thrown a wool cardigan on over her sleeping clothes and had not managed to button it. For 1 full second she did not recognize him. He was the last man she expected to see coming through her door at 2:30 in the morning in the rain. Her knife did not lower. "It's me," he said quietly. "Sophia, it's me." The knife lowered halfway. Her breath went out of her in one long, ragged sound. Behind her, in the small bedroom, under the low child's bed, Emma was pressed flat against the wall with her arms wrapped around Bunny and her large brown eyes fixed on the doorway. She was not crying. She had not made any sound at all. She was only watching. The window in the bedroom slid open behind Sophia. Lorenzo crossed the hallway in one long stride and moved his body past hers. What followed was very short. It was carried in sounds rather than in sight, the wet scrape of a boot on the sill, a low grunt as someone met a shoulder that had not expected a shoulder, the sharp, small crack of glass against a bedside lamp, the dull, heavy sound of a body meeting a wooden floor, and then, after a pause of perhaps 2 seconds, the quiet metallic sound of a knife falling out of a hand that had stopped being able to hold it. Then silence. Then the sound of the rain again, coming through the open window into the small bedroom. Lorenzo stood up slowly. His right hand was pressed against his side, his good hand. His breath was steady. He walked to the low bed, knelt down on his good knee, and lowered his uninjured hand until it rested flat on the floor beside the small pale face pressed against the wall. "Come out, little one. You are safe. It is Uncle Lorenzo." Emma looked at him for a long, careful moment. Then she crawled out from beneath the bed on her elbows, one small fist still clutching the gray ear of the rabbit. She did not run to him. She sat up on the floor beside his knee and looked at his face. He did not touch her. He only offered his open hand palm up on the floorboards. She placed Bunny into it first, And then, very slowly, her small hand on top of the rabbit. He turned his head toward Sophia. Her face was the color of the wall behind her. "Your daughter saved my life," he said. "Now I save hers. You come to the mansion, both of you, tonight. This is not a request." Sophia did not argue. She could not have argued. She packed a canvas bag in 4 minutes, 2 changes of clothes for Emma, one for herself, the small folded photograph of Michael she kept in the drawer of the nightstand, and Emma's box of colored pencils held together by a rubber band. They drove back across the Queensboro Bridge in the same rain. Emma fell asleep against Lorenzo's uninjured shoulder in the front seat before they had reached the middle of the bridge. Bunny pressed between her small chest and his ribs. Debts of blood cannot be paid with money, only with more life. They lived in the mansion after that, not in the small servants' room in the West Wing where Sophia had slept for 3 years, but in a proper guest suite on the 2nd floor, 2 doors down from Lorenzo's own bedroom, chosen by him personally that same night. 2 of Enzo's men were placed outside their door in rotating 12-hour shifts. No one else in the household was told they were there. The war continued for 4 more weeks. It continued in warehouses and on shipping routes and in phone calls that came into the mansion at 3 in the morning. But inside the mansion itself, something else began to happen, quietly, in the spaces between the phone calls. Emma became a small shadow. Wherever Lorenzo went, she went. She sat cross-legged on the floor under the corner of his desk, while he spoke with capos on the study phone, spreading her colored pencils in a careful arc around her small knees, drawing on the back of unused stationery he handed her without looking. She fell asleep on the leather sofa in the study more nights than she slept in her own bed. When she was awake, she would tug lightly on the cuff of his shirt until he bent down, and then she would whisper strange small things into his ear that had no business being spoken during a war. "The moon looks sad tonight, Uncle. The lion in the picture has a curly mane because he's not scared. You didn't eat your breakfast," Bunny saw. She drew houses with 3 yellow windows. She drew 3 stick figures holding hands under a round yellow sun. She drew a big lion with a curled mane and a small crown perched crooked on one ear. Lorenzo taped each drawing to the wall behind his desk, one by one, until they hung there in a row beside the map of the eastern seaboard, with the red pins marking the docks and the warehouses. Sophia, Enzo had told him, had studied nursing for 2 years before she married Michael. She had left the program in her 3rd year, when she became pregnant with Emma. Lorenzo had not known. In 3 years of walking past her in the corridors of his own house, he had not asked her one question about her own life. Now, in the mansion, she began to help, quietly, without being asked. She kept the medical supplies. She changed the dressings on his shoulder herself, twice a day, with hands that were steadier than Dr. Costa's. When soldiers came in wounded from the docks or from Bay Ridge, she was the one who set the small side room off the east corridor with clean linens and a boiled kettle, and the folded gauze she had learned to fold at 18 in a hospital classroom in Astoria. There was a boy named Danny, 19 years old, a soldier for less than a year, taken in a shooting at the Sunset Park Depot on a Thursday afternoon. They brought him into the side room at 10 in the evening. Dr. Costa did what he could. It was not enough. By 2 in the morning it was clear that Danny would not see the sunrise. Sophia sat on a wooden chair beside his low iron bed. She held his hand, his right hand, the one closer to her in both of hers, and she did not let it go. She spoke to him quietly the whole time, though later she would not remember what she had said. Sometimes it was the name of his mother, which he had told her when he was still awake. Sometimes it was only the small nonsense words a woman uses on a sick child in the dark. Danny's breathing slowed sometime after 4. It stopped a little before 5. Lorenzo had come to the doorway an hour earlier and had not come in. He stood in the frame of the door in his shirt sleeves, his left arm still in the sling, and he watched. When Sophia felt the last breath leave the boy's hand, she gently placed his fingers back on the sheet, folded his other hand across his chest, and looked up. Her eyes met Lorenzo's across the low iron bed and the small yellow lamp on the side table. Neither of them spoke. It lasted perhaps 3 seconds, but it was the first time in 3 full years that Lorenzo had truly looked at her, and she had looked back. There are silences that say more than 100 vows. It took Enzo 3 weeks to find them. He found them the way he found most things, not by chasing them, but by waiting near the places they would have to pass through. In the 3rd week, one of his oldest contacts on the Brooklyn waterfront, a shipping clerk who had owed Enzo a favor since a night in 1998, noticed a manifest that did not match the cargo he had loaded that afternoon. An Italian freighter, the Santa Mora, scheduled to leave for Palermo at 5 o'clock on the coming Saturday morning. Container H4471, listed as machine parts, sealed by an outside crew Marco Salvi had once used for smuggling, and had assumed no one else remembered. Enzo brought him the paperwork on Friday night at 9. "He is not going alone," Enzo said. "She is with him, and a doctor. There is a folded cot in the container, a case of water, and a portable oxygen tank. They are planning to survive the crossing inside the box." Lorenzo looked at the manifest for a long time, then he stood up from the desk. "How many of ours can move by 3 in the morning? 30. All ready. Good." He did not tell Sophia where he was going. He looked in on Emma, sleeping on the leather sofa in the study, pulled the wool throw a little higher over her shoulders, and touched the top of her head once, lightly, with the tips of 2 fingers. Then he left. They moved on the container yard at 4:15 in the morning. The mist off the East River had rolled in so thick that the sodium lamps above the yard were only faint orange discs floating in the gray. The great stacked rows of steel containers loomed out of the fog like the walls of a lost city, and the sound of the harbor, the low knocking of hulls against wood, the distant call of a bell buoy carried through the mist without direction. 30 DeLuca soldiers spread out through the rows in 3 teams, moving down the alleys between the containers with their weapons low and their radios pressed close to their mouths. Enzo took the western approach. Lorenzo took the eastern. The third team, under a capo named Vincent, sealed the waterside to make sure no one reached the freighter. The first shots came from row F, a short exchange. 2 Romano guards Marco had brought with him. Both fell. The sound carried through the metal walls of the container stacks and came back to itself as echoes, so that for a moment no one could tell exactly where in the yard the shots had originated. Radios crackled. Names were called across the mist. A flashlight beam sliced through the fog and painted the side of a red container the color of dried rust. 2 more exchanges followed as they narrowed the search. One of the DeLuca soldiers went down in row G, wounded in the thigh, and was pulled behind a container by 2 of his own. Another Romano guard fell in the alley between rows G and H. By 4:42, only the last row remained. Container H4471 sat at the far end of the row nearest the water. Its double doors were unlatched. As Lorenzo's team turned into the alley, the doors of the container opened outward with a low metallic groan, and Marco Salvi stepped into the opening. He had a gun in his right hand. He held it low, along the seam of his trouser leg, the way a man holds a weapon when he does not yet know if he is going to use it. Behind him, in the shadow of the container's interior, stood Vivian. She was wearing a dark coat, buttoned high to her throat, and her hands were folded low across her stomach, which had begun to show clearly beneath the heavy wool. Her face in the container's dim light was very pale, but her chin was steady. Marco looked out into the alley. His eyes found Lorenzo through the fog. For a long moment neither man spoke. The mist moved between them in slow, soft ropes. Then Marco raised his weapon. 3 shots. 2 of them struck the wall of the container above Lorenzo's shoulder. The third grazed the sleeve of Enzo's coat as he moved to cover. Lorenzo returned fire once. Only once. Marco fell backward into the mouth of the container. His gun hit the metal floor with a small, dull sound and slid a short distance across it. Vivian did not scream. She did not run. She crossed the 2 meters between them in 3 fast steps, dropped to her knees on the container floor beside him, and gathered his head into her lap. Her hands were shaking. She pressed one palm flat against the side of his face and did not lift it. Around the container, the DeLuca soldiers stopped moving. They lowered their weapons slightly. They waited for the word from Lorenzo, and the word did not come. Some people wait their whole lives for a chance to run. Vivian, at that moment, chose to stop running. Marco lay across her lap with his head turned slightly toward the open doors of the container. The dark stain spreading through the wool of his gray sweater was slow, and Vivian's hand had gone flat over it without pressing. The way a hand rests on a wound it already knows it cannot close. Her other hand was still cupped against the side of his face. The mist above the container yard had begun to thin. Somewhere behind the stacked rows, above the water, the first band of orange had lifted over the horizon of the Atlantic. The light came in low across the yard, threading through the alleys between the containers, and it found the 2 of them inside the mouth of the last box at the end of row H, a woman on her knees, a man across her lap. The first color of a new day laid softly across both of them. Marco turned his eyes toward the alley. He found Lorenzo where Lorenzo had not moved. His voice, when it came, was quiet and broken, and did not sound like the voice of the man who had stood at Lorenzo's right shoulder for 15 years. It sounded like the voice of the boy Lorenzo had known once, in a red-checkered restaurant a long time ago, who had thrown himself in front of a second bullet with nothing in the world to gain by it. "I loved you like a brother, Lorenzo." He drew a small breath. "That was never the lie. But I also wanted what you had. I could not carry both, and I chose wrong. His head settled a small inch lower against Vivian's knee. His right hand, the one that had held the gun, opened slowly and did not close again. Those were the last words he spoke. At the water side of the yard, at the far end of Vincent's line, the sound came before the sight. Boat engines, 2 of them, low and moving fast. The remaining 8 of Don Vittorio Romano's soldiers, sent out from the New Jersey side of the harbor in the last hour to rescue his daughter, had crossed the river under cover of the same mist and had reached the pier at the far edge of the container yard. They came up over the seawall at the eastern edge of Vincent's line. The last exchange of the war opened in the alleys between rows I and J. It was short. Vincent's men had the higher ground. Enzo had already been in radio contact with the small team he had placed at the mouth of the harbor an hour earlier, and by the time the 8 men from the water reached the second row of containers, the trap around them was already closing. But in the confusion of those 2 or 3 minutes, several stray rounds passed through the alley in front of container H4471. Vivian did not lie down. She did not move. She had been asked, once, by a young DeLuca soldier who had approached her carefully with his hand out, to please step back from the container while things resolved. She had shaken her head once. She had not spoken. She had kept her hand where it was, on the side of Marco's face. A round from the alley later determined, by the caliber and by the angle of entry, to have come from the weapon of one of her father's own men passed through her side. She did not cry out. She only lowered herself slowly down beside Marco, so that her cheek was resting against the shoulder of his gray sweater. Her hand did not leave his hand. Her eyes remained open. At the mouth of the harbor, Don Vittorio Romano was pulled out of a speedboat by 2 of Enzo's men who had been waiting in the dark since 3 in the morning. He did not resist. He was 70 years old that autumn, and he had already understood, from the sound of the second engine failing to answer his radio, that the water had been closed behind him. He would be handed over, by the end of that week, to the Council of the 5 Families under the old law that governed the punishment of men who started wars without cause. The sun came fully up over the water, the last of the mist lifted from the container yard. Lorenzo walked out of the alley of row H alone, past the men who were beginning to stand down, past the low sound of Enzo giving quiet orders on his radio, and he did not stop until he reached the wooden pier at the end of the yard. He stood there for a long time. His left shoulder was still wrapped. The wound had opened again during the firing, and a small line of blood had begun to soak through the shirt beneath his coat. He did not look at it. He looked at the sun instead, a hard red disk lifting slowly out of the Atlantic, and he listened. For the first time in 4 weeks, there were no gunshots. There was only the sound of the water knocking gently against the wooden pilings beneath his feet, and the first gulls of the day calling somewhere out over the harbor. He had won everything. He had lost everything. On some mornings, those 2 are the same sentence. 3 weeks passed after the container yard. The world outside the mansion moved on the way the world always moves on. Newspapers printed short, careful stories about a shooting at the Brooklyn waterfront that no one on the record could confirm. The docks reopened. The trucks began to move again along the coast. The Council of the 5 Families received Don Vittorio Romano in a private chamber in Little Italy on the second Tuesday after the container yard, and what happened to him after that door closed was known only to the men who had sat around that table and did not need to be spoken of again. Inside the mansion, however, nothing moved at all. Lorenzo had walked into his study on the morning after the container yard, closed the tall oak door behind him, and turned the brass key in the lock. He had not come out since. He did not receive the capos. He did not answer the phone. He did not eat. He slept, when sleep came, in the old leather armchair behind the desk, 2 hours at a time, and he woke up in the same clothes he had worn the morning before. The DeLuca empire drifted without its boss. The capos held it together by the memory of him rather than by any current instruction from him. Enzo Marchetti handled what needed handling and reported nothing across the closed door. Old Salvatore Bruno's son, who had inherited his father's chair at the council table a month earlier at the age of 31, sent word twice through Enzo asking permission to visit. Enzo returned each time with the same message and the same answer, which was no answer at all. None of them pushed the door. It was not done. Under the old law, when a boss grieved, one waited. One did not knock. One did not ask. A man who had lost the 2 people who had known him most in the world was owed the room he asked for. Emma came every morning at 9. She had learned the corridor by the 4th day. She sat down on the small woven runner outside the study door, with her legs folded to one side, and her red pencil held carefully in her small right hand. On the back of whatever piece of paper Sophia had given her that morning, the back of a grocery list, the back of an old envelope, Once the back of a hospital pamphlet Dr. Costa had left on a hallway table, she drew a new picture. A house with 3 yellow windows, 3 stick figures holding hands, a round yellow sun, a lion with a curled mane. Sometimes she added a moon in the corner of the sky. When she finished, she pressed the drawing flat against the floor and slid it, very carefully, under the small gap beneath the study door. She did not knock. She had understood, without anyone telling her, that knocking was not what this door needed. Sophia carried a tray to the door 3 times a day. She set it down on the small hall table across from the door: soup at breakfast, a plate of bread, and something warm at midday, a covered dish in the evening. She did not knock. She did not call his name. When she came back 4 hours later and found the previous tray untouched, she lifted it, carried it away, and replaced it with the next one without expression. Inside the study, behind the locked door, the drawings began to accumulate on the floor just inside the threshold. They came in one at a time, sliding across the wood and stopping against the edge of the Persian runner. Lorenzo did not pick any of them up. He looked at them from the armchair sometimes, without moving, and then he looked away again. By the 21st morning, there were 17 drawings on the floor inside the door. He had not opened a single one. Grief has its own architecture. Sometimes it looks exactly like a locked door with a child's drawings sliding underneath. On the 22nd morning, Emma pushed open the study door. No one had stopped her, because no one had been watching. Sophia had gone downstairs to boil the kettle for the morning tray. The 2 men Enzo had stationed at the far end of the corridor had turned their heads to speak with each other. Emma had walked up to the door as she did every morning at 9, and this time, when her small hand reached up to the brass handle instead of the floor beneath the door, she found the handle unlocked. She did not know it was unlocked because Lorenzo had turned the key at 3 in the morning without knowing why, and she did not know it was unlocked because she was 3 years old and had never turned that handle before. She simply pushed. The door swung inward on its heavy hinges. Lorenzo lifted his eyes from the arm of the leather chair where he had been staring for perhaps 2 hours. Emma stood in the doorway with Bunny under one arm. She looked at the pile of paper on the floor just inside the door: 17 drawings. 1 for each morning she had come. Then she stepped over them, small bare feet moving carefully around the edges of her own artwork, and crossed the study to the desk. She did not stop at the desk. She walked around it, reached up, and pulled herself up into his lap with the certainty of a 3-year-old who has never been told no. She placed Bunny into the crook of his uninjured arm. She looked up into his face with her large brown eyes. "Uncle," she said, in the smallest and most ordinary voice in the world, "if the bad people go away, can the good people stay with you?" Lorenzo DeLuca, the man who had bent 30 years of war under his name, the man who had put Marco Salvi down in the mist of the Brooklyn container yard without his hand shaking once, cried for the first time since the night his father had died. He did not cry loudly. His shoulders shook, and no sound came out of him at all. He gathered Emma against his chest, one arm around her small back, and the other hand pressed flat against the top of her head, and he lowered his face into her hair. Sophia was already in the doorway. The morning tray was still in her hands. The teacup on it was rattling slightly against its saucer, because her hands were shaking. 2 tears had slipped down her cheeks, and she had not noticed them. Lorenzo looked at her over the top of Emma's head. His eyes found hers across the room and did not look away. Sophia, 1 word, only her name. He had not spoken it out loud in 3 years. She set the tray down on the sideboard and walked into the study. 1 year later, Lorenzo founded the Antonio DeLuca Fund, named for his father, to provide for the widows and children of every man who had died in the 4 weeks of the war, on both sides, without distinction. The Romano widows received the same envelope on the same day as the DeLuca widows. No one had ever heard of such a thing. Sophia was named the executive director. She hired a small staff, opened a modest office in Midtown, and learned to sign her name at the bottom of official documents in a steady, clear hand. Emma was enrolled in a private kindergarten on the Upper East Side. She carried Bunny to school every day, tucked in the top of her small backpack with one gray ear hanging out. 2 years after that, in the white rose garden of the DeLuca mansion, in the same corner of the same garden where another woman had once placed his hand on her stomach, Lorenzo knelt on the gravel path in front of Sophia and lifted a small silver band from his pocket. It was a plain ring. It was not the emerald from the family vault. That ring had been placed back in its velvet box the morning after the container yard and had been sealed inside the vault, never to be given again. Sophia said yes through her tears. She said it 3 times, because the first 2 came out too quietly to be sure of. The wedding was small, 30 guests. It was held in the same garden, on a Saturday afternoon in late May, when the white roses had begun to open. Emma wore a small white dress with a sash of pale blue ribbon at the waist. She held both their hands as they walked down the short gravel aisle between the folding chairs, one small palm in each of theirs. And when the officiant reached the line that asked who gives this couple to each other, Emma answered in the loudest and clearest voice a 3-year-old had ever managed to produce at a wedding. "I do." Then she turned her head and looked up at Lorenzo, and for the first time in her small life, she called him by a name she had chosen herself. Papa. The man who had once made the entire underworld lower its voice when he entered a room had, at last, found the one thing that power and violence had never been able to give him: a real family, built out of loyalty, out of sacrifice, and out of a love that had asked for nothing in return. If today's story has touched your heart, please tap the like button. It truly helps this story reach more people who may need to hear it today. If you are new to our channel, please subscribe. We tell stories exactly like this one, every single week. Share this video with someone in your life who needs a reminder today that the truth always finds its way to the light, and that the good people, in the end, do get to stay. And please leave us a comment. We read every line, and every message you leave gives us the strength to keep telling these stories. Until then, dear friend, goodbye. Take care of yourself, and we will see you again in the very next story.